Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to UI Breakfast webinar space. We have an amazing guest today, and today's webinar is certainly overbooked. We are going to be talking about UX mapping with Andy Parker. Hey, Andy. Thank you so much for making it today.
No problem.
You have slides for this presentation first. So just to give you an idea of the structure, we will spend around 20 minutes listening to your ideas, and then there will be Q&A time to answer all your questions. I upfront apologize for calling this a workshop because it's a workshop about running workshops. And it's not going to be that much of a workshop, but we're definitely going to talk about practice here. So, Andy, please go ahead with your presentation.
All right, let's try and work out how to actually do that.
And while you're working on that, I'd like to say a few more words. You probably listened to the podcast episode with Andy last week, which was a hit. And we met up with Andy at LTV conference in Brighton. And I was instantly amazed by his approach to solving UX questions and problems, because he said that the only way to solve them is by bringing people together in one room, which as a remote worker is pretty strange for me, but it definitely works. So, Andy, please go ahead with your slides.
Okay, let's get going. All right, so first of all, obviously, thank you everybody for attending today, and for those of you that check this out afterwards, we are going to have a Q&A at the end, and if you still have some questions, obviously it's going to be on YouTube. I'm on Twitter and everything else, and you're more than welcome to get in touch afterwards. So for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to explain what an experience journey map is, or a user experience journey map is, what to use them for, and how to run a collaborative workshop with your colleagues or client in order to create a shared understanding of your users and each other's roles in creating great experiences. So my name's Andy. I am a UX coach and founder of the digital consultancy We Are AFK. I'm based in England most of the time, but if that's too broader area for you to search on, you can also find me on Twitter with the name The Evangelist, and of course you can email me hello@weareafk.co.uk, and all of those details will be at the end. So I teach businesses, teams and individuals how to introduce design thinking, user experience and collaborative exercises into the existing processes. I use design games in workshop environments to break down communication barriers and team hierarchies, and ultimately bringing people together to solve these problems. Today, I'm going to show you how to set up and run this workshop on user experience journey mapping. And this photo was taken last year at UX Bristol, where myself and my associate Harry Brignall taught around about 100 people how to run this workshop in under an hour. Obviously, we're going to cover a little bit less because we're going to not be hands-on with it this time, but hopefully you'll be able to sort of get the idea of it. So let's talk about what user experience maps are for. So you might have seen in the past a customer experience map like this one. These often come in the form of a day in the life of a customer, and the idea is to record their behavior to find opportunities for your product to interact with in their daily life. So user experience journey maps are quite similar to this, except that you're going to immerse yourself in the emotions, thoughts and actions of this particular individual. What it's not is a user journey or a user story. A user journey focuses only on the interactions with your product. And whilst you can use it in this way, or use these techniques in this way, in order to begin instilling empathy into your user journeys, which I do recommend everybody does, we want to actually understand a lot more. So let's actually talk about what exactly that is. So firstly, it helps us to look outside the product lens. Your product may only interact with people within a small slice of this journey. And what we're doing here is highlighting to everyone involved that the user experience begins and ends way beyond the reaches of your actual product. It's not uncommon for UX designers to be employed to work on a single product, even if an organization has multiple services or products. And your focus is then only being on what happens at the point of landing on the website to the point of leaving, and not necessarily things either side of that. But with this, we can uncover specific pain points for our persona, which we may not have considered are a problem or a barrier to entry. And this means that we can find new opportunities and generate exciting ideas of how to alleviate those pain points and add delighters to our existing touchpoints. It benefits all of us to become more in tune with our customers. Experience maps give us a clear visualization of the emotional state of our customers and ways in which we can support them. It can also be used as a tool for decision making. And by the end of this workshop, you're going to have a number of new opportunities to explore or ideas to dig deeper into and areas you may not have ventured into in the past. Seeing how these correlate to the minds and hearts of your users will guide you to making better decisions on what to make next. So this is an incredibly cheap and easy to run workshop. And most of these materials you probably already have in the office, but just in case, I'm going to go through the things that you're going to need. So this was actually raised by someone in the questions earlier on today. You do need a persona, or at the very least, someone that you want to know more about. The purpose of this entire exercise is to create this empathic picture of what your persona goes through. Now, it doesn't really matter what fidelity your persona is in, just that you know you're going to be following this person through their journey. And I'm not going to go into detail right now about my thoughts on personas, but if this is your first time running this workshop, I recommend you focus on just your primary persona. We also need to know what journey our persona is going to be experiencing. And this hopefully is quite obvious to you because you have a product or a service that solves a problem. So the experience that we're going to be looking at is obviously going to be how you fit into that market, what the actual thing that your product or service does. Most experiences I find can be solved in a very simple formula. But what happens in each of those stages, that's what we want to know more about. And remember, we're not trying to map how people use our product. What we're wanting to find out is how we can help people and understand how our product may do that, or other things we can do in order to help them. So I always put brown paper on walls that I'm going to use for collaboration. This is because most of us don't have the luxury of permanent wall space. The greatest advice I can give anyone running a workshop is to put up paper like this on the walls because it's easier for you to roll up and take somewhere else if you lose that wall or the space is only for temporary use. But don't lose the actual map. It might sound really insane, but I heard a story of a colleague spending an entire day doing a design studio exercise where they began the morning with creating these personas. They built empathy maps, user journeys, story mapping, finishing up on this big experience map, rolled it all up, taped it, headed to the train, and then forgot to pick it up when they got off the train. So whatever you do at the point when you leave the room, remember to actually take everything with you. Masking tape was designed to ensure that paint stays on walls. So rather than taking the risk of trashing the meeting room or workshop space with blue tack, I use masking tape for holding everything up. It's also a really quick way of being able to draw out the rows and grids on your map, which at least will give you some kind of straight lines. If anyone's tried to do it with a pen before, you know what I'm talking about. Post-it notes, of course, it's a UX exercise, so where would be without post-it notes? I actually recommend having 3 colors to hand. So maybe your standard yellow for all of the things that people are going to input onto it, and then 2 different colors, one for actions and one for opportunities. And that will make more sense as we move along. Sharpies. So we all love them, right? There's nothing nicer than using a brand new Sharpie, but let's try and think about the environment and be a little bit responsible. If you've got boxes and boxes of them lying around, don't go buying more just for the sake of having a new workshop. You're also going to need a camera. So, okay, a DSLR may be a little bit overkill, but your phone will always do the job quite nicely. I'd recommend that you always take photos of your workshops. Not only are they a great way of documenting this collaborative process in order to be able to share it with other teams, stakeholders in the business, but they can really make the difference in your case studies and portfolio pieces, because it's going to show that you actually collaborate with other people and that you get your team or your client involved in all of the work that you do. And finally, the most important thing for any workshop is, of course, people. So we'll go over what kinds of people that you should invite in a moment. But before that, let's take a look at what we're actually going to be creating. So this map was created to understand the experience of purchasing a cell phone. What you can kind of get from this is that it shows the timeline across the top, which is defined by these large themes that relate to a general purchase experience, where we start in a research mode, then we go through this purchase mode and finish in this post-purchase cycle. The rows underneath is where we include our actions, like in a customer experience map, and also our empathy points. So these rows represent a quadrant you might have seen before in something like this, which is an empathy map. If you've already done empathy mapping for your persona, you should bring this into your workshop. A lot of the things here will probably relate to a particular part of the experience, so it would make sense for them to be in there. But don't worry if you haven't done this previously, because we're going to be doing it on the map itself. So let's take a look at how this experience map is structured. So first of all, we have this timeline. It's actually in two parts, but this is the first one, which is broken into themes or steps within the journey. They can be quite large buckets, as in this example, or they may be more finer details required. You can usually tell whether this theming is needed if you have an idea of some of the actions involved in the journey. Sometimes it's actually easier to start by stepping through all of the actions and creating the themes after. This is really just a way of being able to have an understanding of what phase somebody is in within the journey, so that you can talk about it a little bit better in future discussions and future meetings and workshops. Actions is the first row to be filled in. So these are all the things that your persona needs to do in order to get to the end destination. For example, checking the amount of time left on their contract or visiting a local store. They can also be things that they see, hear, or talk about with others. The thinking and feeling row is where we put in all of those questions your persona has and observations they may be making. For example, how long is actually left on my contract? Or my friend has just bought a new phone. I wonder what they think about it. Frustrations and obstacles are the biggest pain points in any experience. Just think about when you've bought something and you want to return it, but the shop says that they have a policy of only giving credit notes. This is a frustration, and we can understand it better by putting it in the context of this entire experience. Perhaps something earlier on in our journey could have made this a positive instead of a negative. Having this kind of evidence will help you inform your colleagues as to what resolving the matter is really worth, not just to your customer, but to your entire business. The gains row is a way of us expressing what our persona needs and their goals. It may seem like a really obvious thing to have, but it can actually take time to fill it in and often requires discussion to really get to the bottom of what our persona is doing all of this for. Finally, we have this opportunities row. This is where we can record all the ideas that relate to the above steps. The things we want to explore further, introduce, or develop that will ultimately create a better experience for our persona. So I said about people before, one of the biggest questions I'm sure you're going to have is, who do you actually invite to this workshop? Well, as you've seen, the workshop is exploring the entire end-to-end experience with your product sitting somewhere in it. So you want to have people in your workshop who you believe have a good understanding of each of these core areas, and that will have an insight into what is currently happening within that area. I reckon about 6 to 8 people if you can. That's usually a good size for a group. I have run it with a lot more, and that can work, but be careful of creating a group so big that they can't all fit in the room and look at the wall. When this happens, you'll see a lot of participants completely disengage with the activity. They'll start checking their phones and they'll begin side conversations, and you don't want that. If you're going to do it with a larger group of people, then I would recommend, again, still trying to keep it to sort of absolute maximum of 6 to 8 people per group. And perhaps you would have multiple maps on multiple walls and then collate all of that together at the end to see what similarities and what things are unique between each of the groups. So think about the people that you invite. Do you want management people because they may have the final say on the outcomes, or would you rather have people from their teams who are more likely to be exposed to customers on a day-to-day basis? I'd always go for a mix, but always try to make it heavily tilted towards people who are actually exposed to customers, or at the very least, really know about what's going on. Okay, so getting to the point of actually running the session. First thing is that ahead of time, you want to get into the room and get it prepared. So get your paper up, get the grid arranged. And if you do already have themes, I'd recommend adding them in too. I also quite like to print out the persona templates and put it at either end of the map for reference, so that when people are standing and looking at the wall, they can always go back and sort of remind themselves of like, okay, so who is this persona? What are they about? What do we think their needs are? So once everyone is settled, explain what you're going to be doing today and what the purpose of it is. Remember to say how long you expect it to take, and ideally, if you can, make it a little bit less than what you'd actually arranged it to be. People always kind of like to know when they're going to be wrapping something up. Next up is to do a walkthrough of your persona. This is so that everyone is familiar with them. And remember that some people may have never even heard of a persona before, let alone this persona. So make sure to give yourself enough time to allow for questions and explain that this is actually part of the exercise, because the information that's going to come out of this map is going to help us be able to feed back into that persona and grow it even more with this new empathic information. Now it's time to bring everyone to the wall. So very briefly explain how it works, that we're going to fill this in left to right, top to bottom. And before I go through the steps of this exercise, I'm going to give you a couple of tips on workshop facilitation. If you're part of a product team, then it would kind of make sense for you to be contributing what you know to this map as well. If you're an external agent, I would actually try to avoid getting involved in this unless you get a sense that they're being hesitant to contribute. Sometimes it can encourage people to get up if they see someone else is doing it. And in that kind of scenario, it's actually okay for that to be you. So whilst everyone is working their way along, read through things that are being posted up, because you may find something that you want to raise as a question and see what other people's input is on the subject. I've found that people tend to naturally do things like moving post-its around if they're not in the right place, or stacking up duplicates. It just seems to be almost a knee-jerk reaction that people would do that. This autonomy usually then creates conversations between participants, and that naturally triggers thoughts on what we're looking at, and new ideas start to form. What you're actually looking for is if there becomes a longer discussion somewhere within the group on an area, and to be able to pause everyone and share it, because it may be that someone else has some thoughts on it. They might not have actually reached that point of looking through the map. And it will help sort of unblock that and keep the flow going, but also bring attention to something that's worthwhile. Okay, so back to the exercise at hand. The first step is to start them off by filling in the actions row. It doesn't actually matter too much if people spread around dotting post-its anywhere along the timeline, as long as we can see that there is some form of progression and that the timeline is being filled. Because as we go through it, inevitably someone will think about, oh, actually there's this other thing that someone has to do. Like, for example, in the case with the cell phones, you might have a contract and there may be a particular period where you can upgrade, but you can't actually cancel it. So how do they find out about that information? What is going to be the process that they go through to do that? There's always a possibility that something will just come out of nowhere when you think that you've finally got it down. So once the actions are in, which to be honest, usually only takes about 5 minutes, I would suggest to get people to start working around the other rows. And this is where it kind of becomes a little bit freeform. You can cover whatever you want, and remember that there is a possibility that a post-it note will overlap a particular step or overlap one of the rows. Keep an eye on the rate at which things are being put up, and if you can see that it's starting to slow down, then that is usually a good indicator that people have exhausted their thoughts on it. And that's a good time to stop. I found that usually about 20 minutes is enough for even some of the longer processes, but you're in the room. That's what you're there to judge, so you can always extend this time if you think that it needs to be. Now, it's only natural that when we think of a problem, we're already thinking of a solution. And you may find people start putting things into this row automatically. You're going to finish up this exercise by asking people to look through each column and see if they can think of ideas of how they may be able to remove a barrier, provide support, or enhance the experience in the way that is being described. This is actually a relatively short part of the activity, so don't let it drag, because you'll find that people will be scratching their heads trying to find smart things to put down, or really trying to go into detail of explaining what they mean in a single post-it note. The reality is that whatever's already been put on the board is probably a good enough starting point for further exploration, and you might find that there's that one winning idea in there. So as I say, within about 15-20 minutes, you're going to see a lot of post-it notes up, and if everything's gone well, everyone would have been looking at the points people have put in, maybe extending on them, and coming up with some suggestions on how they think they can help in those areas. You've now got this very detailed empathic map of your customer experience, and it highlights where you currently fit into the experience, and you may have uncovered some potential areas that you can extend your reach and how to help your users further. At this point, you may want to get people to dot vote on some of those items in the opportunities row to give you an indicator of where to start looking next. But you may also want to save this for another exercise once you've had time to develop these thoughts further. It's really entirely up to you. So before everyone leaves, there's a few things that I recommend that you do. First and foremost, wrap up the session. So explain what we looked at today, what you're going to be doing next with it, when you will share the outcomes with the group and how you're going to share them, and how people can contact you if there are any questions. Particularly if you work for an agency and you're coming in, some of the people that get invited to the workshop you might not have actually spoken to before, and they might have more questions. They may well think of something later on that they want to talk to you about, but equally in really large organizations, there's always a possibility that you've got someone there that you've never had the opportunity to speak to before. And it's always good to give people your contact details afterwards. So every item that you've got in the opportunity row is worth adding to whatever backlog you use. Even if it's just putting into a spreadsheet so that you can later go through these and add the context to them. For example, you've got all of this information above that opportunities card that was on the experience map. You should be adding that information into the story to explain, what was going on and why you think it's worth looking at it. And then you can do other exercises later on to validate them as ideas and prioritize the ideas or concepts further. Finally, make some form of a lightweight record of what happened. So just a brief report on how the workshop went and the key findings from it. It's always good to share with those who weren't part of the exercise what happened, as well as those that were, what the purpose of it was, and what you've discovered as well. So that's kind of the end of this walkthrough. I hope you found some useful ideas in there, and obviously we're going to move over to some questions at the moment. If you'd like to talk to me more about running these workshops or even coming into your business to help facilitate on one of them, then please get in touch. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. This was super, super awesome and actionable too. I, frankly speaking, never run anything like that in my life, and I imagine that can be very great for a team and for a product. So before we jump into the questions from our listeners, I have a few more for myself, if you would like to answer them first.
Sure.
As you mentioned, please welcome on screen. So as you mentioned, wrapping up process. So you've taken that huge. So you've taken it down, wrapped up in your bag, taken the photo, shared with people, maybe learned, like, let's say 5 to 10 strategic takeaways from that. But is it further down the road used by other people in their work, or is it just the user experience specialist that refers it from time to time?
That's a really good point, and I know that it was something that someone had actually sent me on Twitter earlier as well, which was about sort of the life cycle of the exercise. So the whole thing about taking photographs of the actual map itself, I think it certainly makes sense to do that in order to be able to create like a digital backup if the worst thing was to happen. I've tried so many times in the past to take all of those pictures and stitch them together in Photoshop and try and recreate it. And it is really difficult to actually look through it in any kind of sensible way. But it's certainly not a bad thing to do. So for me, the main thing is that this is something which you could potentially be adding to over time. And if you were working in a product team, for example, then it's the kind of thing where you want it to exist in a permanent basis. And I've seen a lot of people that spend a load of money getting it designed up and then printed out so that it's continually on the wall, and that they can go through it and sort of mark off the things that they have attended to or where they're going to look next with it. But it can actually just work just as well just having it in that very crude post-it note format. And in fact, if you take a look, I think if you search on the GDS blog, so the Government Digital Services in the UK, there's a rather fantastic video and write-up about how they did an experience map for one of the particular services, and it is permanent on the wall in post-its, and they've got a whole crazy color coding system for how it's kind of managed and everything. But it really should be something where anyone should be able to walk past it and see, oh, there's a problem in this particular area. Maybe that's what I'm responsible for. That's sort of the whole point. It's why you invite all of these different people from different teams so that they can help identify potential problems that you might have, with your product or with your service that they're involved with, and that it can be shared with other people. So I don't think it's something which is really like solely the responsibility of like the UX designer or the UX team in a business.
Mm-hmm. Can it be well represented in a spreadsheet, or is it so, haphazard and creative that it can't be?
No, it's totally possible. I have done it myself because it can sometimes be an easy way of being able to to digitize it and to share it, particularly if you've got groups which are remote. They're not all in the same building. You can't all sort of look at it because it's this very simple grid-based structure. It is actually possible to just then convert that into a spreadsheet. I actually did it recently in Sketch. So I, tried to, what's the old word? Skeuomorphic design of it, where, I made fake post-it note graphics and stuck the words on them with a Sharpie font and things like that. So it is possible to use various different tools to sort it out. But I mean, one of the main things is obviously this whole idea that this opportunities row that you've got building up across the bottom is ultimately your recommendation points of things that you want to explore, and can go into your product backlog if you're running one, that you can then start to build up the stories on that to work out what you're going to create.
From your experience, does it more look like feature creep, or is it more like enhancements and small additions to the process?
Well, it can be a bit of both.
The bottom line.
Yeah, it can be a bit of both. I don't think there's as much feature creep as you think that there would be. And that's in part because the whole idea is that you're mapping out this end-to-end experience without it having the context of your product. So if you think of like that example there with like the buying the cell phone, there's nothing there that says what that, was it the website for a particular mobile phone carrier or a website for a particular phone manufacturer? It doesn't say that. It just says, I'm a person, I have a need, which is I need a new mobile phone. And now we're going to map through all of the possible things that person could go through. We all know that somewhere within those themes and those actions, we've got a product that would help alleviate some of those things or help them through that process. But we're not being really prescriptive with that. We're just trying to highlight the points of it might be that it's things where we can say, oh, our product would actually helps with that particular part, and that post-it note and that opportunity is summarizing that. But it's more about finding those new opportunities and things that you hadn't even thought about were a problem.
Did you hear me?
I didn't.
I think I was muted. Yeah, that was a great answer. Thank you. We have plenty of questions. It's 20 minutes per workshop. Is that right? Technical question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of know based on the actual like product or service you have, and if it's something where it's quite a technical process, then it may be that you think that you need more time. But I've actually found every time I've done it, I don't think I've spent more than half an hour. And then even after that half an hour, it feels really awkward and like we're just sort of trying to drag out the time. So I will close it down. So I normally arrange for about an hour and a half for the amount of time to sort of like book out for the whole thing. And then that gives you plenty of time to sort of introduce and explain what you're going to be doing at the beginning, maybe talk about what you've been doing up to this point, like how you've reached this point of why you want to do this exercise. I think that's really important, especially when you've got people that aren't necessarily involved in, say, the project or product development or whatever, to be able to talk about the persona in a little bit more detail, explain where they've come from, how you're going to use them, and then obviously to sort of get people warmed up and moving into that actual doing the exercise part. So yeah, about 20 minutes probably for the actual exercise end to end, but I'd say an hour, maybe an hour and a half if you wanted to, for like booking out the whole session.
Great. So the top question, looking forward, the top question is, what is UX mapping? I think we all kind of understood that. And when is it used in the design process? So it's after you mapped out the persona. Any other comments on this?
Yeah.
That's a question by Jonas Schmidt. Yeah. Thank you, Jonas.
it obviously is a very good question, and it's a really obvious one. Hopefully I've made that clear. So the main thing is it really is this combination of a load of things that you've done up to that point. So the first thing is that it is about creating more empathy with your user. It has this added bonus of getting this group of people together who don't necessarily work together every day, and getting them to actually collaborate and to understand and appreciate the problems of the customer. And in terms of where to put it, I think you can really kind of do it at any point. I mean, there's been instances where you've got a long-standing business, and it's probably the best thing to do at the beginning, because maybe you've checked out and they've already got personas that seem to be fairly well defined. They've got a very clear understanding of where they sit in the market and what they're about, and it's just a good way of actually kicking it off, because it then kind of gets everything out in the air. In something where it's trying to figure it out a little bit earlier on, then it could be that it's you've developed some personas, you've got a bit of an understanding of what the problem space is, what the problem need is. There's a very clear value proposition for the product or the service, and at that point it's really good to do it. But I think you can kind of, if you've never done it before, I would absolutely recommend doing it regardless. It takes very little time, and I think it's a really great way of opening some people's eyes to the realities of what happens outside of your four walls, and that it isn't just this about defining what happens within your product.
Like any other strategy exercise, very valuable.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Next question by Aaron JM. How is UX mapping linked to business goals and KPIs? So is there any data attached, or is it all soft?
I suppose there isn't a direct correlation between the two, but what you're doing here is you're ultimately trying to understand what the need is. So you could argue that it's actually determining whether or not you have a market fit. Because if you're not solving any of the problems that this person has, then you're kind of wasting your time, because what you're actually doing is providing them with something that they either know absolutely nothing about or weren't looking for in the first place. So from that respect, I suppose it has got some kind of relation to it. In terms of like key performance indicators, you could actually do something with that. So let's say, for example, that part of it is we want to know that when someone has purchased a phone, so let's keep with that kind of that theme. Let's say that we're actually one of the mobile phone companies, and so you've gone through this process and you're now at the point where you've received the phone. So you paid for the phone, you're in this what we call like post-purchase process. How are we going to determine whether or not you're actually happy with what you got? Because it's a really difficult area to work in. You know, you can't really go into a phone shop anymore and actually physically pick one up with it on and play around with it. You can't use it. So how do we know whether people are actually happy with it? Are they happy with the way that it was delivered in the post? Are they happy with what was in it? So you could actually use it to start then determining KPIs that you could be setting. You know, it might be net promoter scores, or how do we follow up with these people once they've received it, and what can we learn, you know, what feedback loops can we put in? So there's definitely opportunities for you to be able to start leaning it more into sort of like the business values.
Great question, thank you. Great answer too. So the question by John Thomas: how do you sell the value of UX mapping when you're a solo consultant or external agency versus being like an employer or of this very actual team? So how do you sell it externally?
Yeah, that's quite a weird question for me, because I think it would be harder, as is always the case, and the sort of the whole concept of, you know, undercover UX is that it's always harder to persuade the company that you're already in to do new things rather than one that you're coming into from the outside. So if it's part of your process, then that's what they've bought into. So I'm a bit confused as to why it would be difficult to persuade people to do it. This is an exercise. Here's what you're going to get from it, and we're going to do it.
You know, that's because all you sell is UX exercises, but normal people here, they do all other stages of the project, like starting from the research and ending. This is research, but still like more typical research, not exercises, and then design and development. So this is all very like vague valued thing. Extra tips on selling that.
So I think that the key thing for me whenever I've explained it to people is that it is understanding the value for the customer, and to always remember, and this is always true. And I think we talked about it in the podcast, this idea of, you know, the customer is always right. In the same respect, your client, if you're an agency or an independent agent, your client, you have to go on the basis of that they're the expert in the field and that they know everything that needs to ever be known about their customers. The benefit of this workshop in that respect is that it is an opportunity for you to be able to be immersed in what they already know, so that you can be ramped up to speed and have this clear understanding of the landscape that you're working in. So it's kind of for your benefit. What ends up happening is that there's a lot of realization in these exercises where various different teams don't realize that something is a particular problem. Maybe they should look into it, but someone else is very aware of it. They deal with it all the time. So it creates that shared understanding. It's all about building up that appreciation for where everybody sits within the flow.
Great. Next question, and I'm so into it because I don't live in London all the time. This is by Travis Holiday, and his question is: any tips or tricks on conducting these workshops remotely? Because I know we talked about that, and you said no, that we should do this in person, but maybe there is hope.
Yeah, we did. I did actually make a note, which I've got here. Travis, remote workshops, no. That is still sort of the rule. I've never tried it because it just seems really counterintuitive to me. The whole benefit of doing a workshop is about having people working together collaboratively. It's hands-on, and I can't see how you can do that on the other side, because the only way that I can see it even being possible, and perhaps it's from not actually seeing what the exercise is, when, because I know Travis put that question up earlier, it's an exercise where you've got a physical thing that you're filling in. So I don't know what the context he's talking about there. Is it that he's remote and trying to facilitate it remotely, and there's a whole load of people in a room? Because then that means someone's still got to put the map up, someone's still got to be able to read what's going on in it. So I think just the idea of it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Perhaps if you could use an online collaborative tool, maybe that might work. I'm trying to think of what it was called, but there's like a whole bunch of like whiteboard apps and things like that obviously you can use collaborative sharing. I think there's even something in Google Hangouts which allows you to do it. Those kind of like, onboard spaces or whatever, it might work, but then you still haven't really got the ability to be able to know, who actually put that post-it down. How do you have that conversation? So I think remote workshops just seems like a bit of a bizarre combination for me.
Well, let me chime in, because I wrecked my brain on remote workshops lately and researched like all kinds of ideas, and I think this can be kind of hacked together. If there is one like rough guess, rough hack. So for remote workshops, less software the better, actually. So if you have like one facilitator, let's say with the Trello board, who's sharing his screen with the others, and there is a few more people, maybe up to 5 on audio with this person, maybe that could work. What do you think? And they kind of suggest and dictate ideas to him, and he's writing everything down for everyone.
It just doesn't work, because I tell you what happens, and I guarantee every single person that's down the side of my screen here at the moment, Alberto, Beth, you've all been in these situations. We've all dealt with clients remotely or with co-located teams. What happens is you mute your microphone and you go on Facebook and you wait until whoever was talking that you felt that you weren't part of is finished, and then you unmute it and go, yes, I think that's a great idea. And that will just be what happens. Project planning stuff, seen it so many times, especially with something like Trello, because someone has to be driving and everyone else has to listen, or there's one person that's speaking and everyone else has to listen, and you've got a very awkward, you can't see what other people are doing, you can't see their behavior, you don't know if they've just completely switched off and they're using their phone or whatever. So that's why I'm a strong advocate of everybody in the room, because your sole purpose of being there as this workshop facilitator is to be able to spot those things. If someone's checking out, you need to get them back engaged. You've got to build that up. So it's a good idea. And I think if it was maybe like with a small team of people, maybe like 2 or 3 other people, and you're all, say, in startup mode, and you haven't got any choice but to do it in that way, then yeah, it makes total sense. But I certainly wouldn't try and sell it as a service, that's for sure.
Right. But that will work only if everyone really wants to invest, not go check Facebook. I think that's like the deciding factor for remote stuff.
Yeah, and there's a big risk, and again, that's why it's sort of, you really have to think about who you're going to invite, because you don't want to invite people who aren't necessarily the ones that have got a real vested interest in having their thoughts laid out and learning more about the customer and learning more about what's going on with this person and how we're going to make this better. How's our business going to be wherever it wants to be next year?
Great. I'm glad we had this conversation, because like this idea of reconstructing these workshops remotely, it's in the air because there are so many remote teams and remote activities. But too bad. Still need to fly people in. Right.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what a great excuse to get people together as well. Like, this is, as I was saying, this is something where it can work really well as part of a sort of a day's worth of exercises. If you run like a design studio sort of series, then you could be starting your day off with your persona development and maybe a bit of empathy mapping. perhaps around some ideas of like what are the actual problems and trying to understand that and the value proposition, and then finishing off with this like development of this map. So you can sort of package it into a series of exercises that you do over the course of like a full 1 day collaborative workshop, for example.
Gotcha. Great. Next question by Jonas is, what is your definition of UX mapping? Did we answer that, or can you recap it like one sentence?
Yeah, I hope so. So it's very similar to a customer experience map. The key difference is that customer experience maps are often solely focused on the steps which are needed to be taken to get yourself around the board. So we had this sort of almost looked like a game board. The big difference is that this is all about introducing empathy and understanding what's going on in the mind of that person. So it's not just about the steps and actions that they take, but it's about, you know, where they're at in life, you know, who they are, what's going on with them, because those kind of things are the things that have a huge impact on how we see an experience and our sort of feelings from it. And I think anything where you have that traditional transactional process, we've all experienced it. I mean, the number of companies that I hate, even though their products are really great, because I have to pay for returns, for example, right? That's the kind of stuff where if someone had actually gone through that exercise with a bunch of people and they'd realized that this causes a lot of distress, but it also is perhaps something which is stopping people from buying in the first place, they could have had a sensible conversation and a discussion about whether or not they should lift that charge. Is it going to increase our revenue, or, you know, what's the value, what's the benefit going to be for that individual?
Great. Question by Ellie. When do you know that a UX mapping exercise will be beneficial to conduct, especially with the context of an enterprise setting? I think we answered that. I work in a large corporate where teams are always on busy and conflicting schedules, and suggesting something like UX mapping exercise is usually viewed very skeptically from the best use of time perspective. How would you set the context of this up such as it has great chance of success? I think this is very similar to selling it to other people. Essentially, we've talked about that a while. Mm-hmm.
I think it's also something that we touched upon in the podcast last week as well, about the fact that part of the challenge is that those busy conflicting schedules means that you're probably in an organization that has got the virus called meeting, and that every single person's calendar is actually backed up every single day with these completely pointless meetings where there's very little going on. So it would probably help that if you're part of a team, you need to find some advocates for what you're doing. So those people that are going to be rallying behind what you want to do, so that you can kind of get the ball rolling with it. And it might actually be worth trying to see if it's possible to break everyone out of that cycle, because I think the reality is they all don't want to be in those meetings. So if you can come up with a way of like the pseudo away day of actually running the workshop outside, maybe it's about the fact that it is just this 1 hour part, whereas if it was, say, an afternoon that was being booked out for a load of stuff, and that you can express that in a way that is directed at them, what they are going to get out of it, then hopefully you can bring that person who is thinking incredibly selfishly into your workshop, which is this collaborative exercise where they will then learn that actually there's a whole bunch of other people that I work with and we're all trying to do the same thing. This is how I contribute to it. That's how they do. And you can kind of win them over. So it's a bit of a Trojan horse sometimes, I know, to sort of get people to come to these workshops. But what I have found in those situations, and there have been many, is that if you've got someone who can act as your advocate, or a couple of people that can act as an advocate for you to help sort of drum those people up, whether it's that they've got personal assistants or whatever that manage their calendar or something, book it way in advance so that they haven't got an excuse, and ultimately talk to the people that aren't totally convinced about going. I've managed to get CEOs of the most ridiculously sized businesses to turn up to workshops like this just by saying, sending them an email and saying, I'd really like to talk to you about this, and it would be really good for you to be there, and here's why. And they've turned up. So it is just about having a conversation.
Absolutely. We had a great podcast episode about being a UX leader with Danny Setyalan from The Economist. And so his biggest takeaway was developers selling anything design related to any enterprise, entity, instilling. Get a successful narrative, like a little story, how you helped. Give it to your immediate manager. He will give it to their manager. They will give it to their manager. And so everybody's going to have that, argument to discuss. And my thing is that whenever someone gets involved in the activity, he's already sold and involved and is going to advocate for you. So get make them do something for you, and they will help you further along. So it's like a snowball effect. So probably absolutely. This could be one of the key events, getting them together in such workshop.
Yeah, and it really does work, because they once they've reached the end of it and they feel like there's actually been some good conversations, and maybe they have concerns which have been raised and heard and handled, and they've got an understanding of the context of where that all sits, you'll find that those people are often the ones that come up to you afterwards and ask you for your details, because they want to know what you're going to do with the information, because they feel like there's actually some progress. It's broken the status quo of whatever was happening before.
Great. A few more questions from the sidebar. We had a great question from Alberto. Do you see the workshop? Well, this is actually a continuation of the talk. Do you see the workshop as a way to not only solve for some of those problems, but also as a way to educate an organization into changing their ways of helping a cultural shift within? Exactly. That's what we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's actually the most value that I get from it than the opportunity side of things, is that if you can get this cross section of a business, particularly if it is a large one, and have them really thinking in this way about the persona, that individual person that you're supposed to be helping, which is this aggregate of hundreds of thousands at times, then they do start to think about, actually we should have spoken to them about that problem, because we implemented this other thing thinking it was doing something else, and it's actually not worked at all. And I think it can really help with creating that change and having those different teams collaborating a little bit more on the work that they're doing, especially in those really big enterprise businesses where budgets are based on department. Each department has their own pot of money. They just want to spend it on what's focused on them. And it's really stupid to be thinking about that way, especially with stuff that's site related, for example, because your site is not siloed. I mean, a lot of them are, a lot of people's websites are very clearly, departmentalized. And the problem is that you can end up creating this really jarring experience as people traverse through it. And you want to remove that, you want to avoid it. So I definitely think it is a good catalyst for culture change. What you do with it after that, I don't know, but I think it just helps to keep introducing these collaborative exercises where it's not just the same 4 people doing stuff. It's not just the product teams doing something or the web team or whatever. It's about getting different parts of the businesses working together and talking to each other.
Great. There is a very nice question from Jason. Any tips on how to get attendees to remove themselves from the product and just map the problem or need? So kind of because people might want to show off themselves. Once again, make their own role most important. How to battle that?
Yeah, which is it is very difficult to do. I think one of the ways of being able to do that is actually if you've actually done the step side of things already, like the actions. So I was saying before about this idea in this particular example that we've looked at today, we've got this concept of these like core buckets across the top that are themes, and that works. That's really helpful to have, to be able to kind of make something that's a little bit broader that encompasses a whole bunch of different stuff, so that you can manage what you're working on later. But it can sometimes make it a little bit harder than if you just go with the actions. So you could actually work out what those actions are beforehand and put the actions row in yourself under the sort of pretense that people need to look through it and see whether it's right. Or you could just start off the exercise as being about, we're going to start off by just talking about this journey and focusing on, developing these actions. Similar to if you've ever done something like user story mapping, which was obviously quite popular last year because of Jeff's book. The big difference between that and user story mapping is always about the product. So it's got that similar feel where it's like it's the login point to the log out point, or whatever the journey is. But if you read through his book, or even save yourself the money and actually just go and read the blog post that the book was based on, it's all about getting this guy who was working with, that had this idea for this product, to sit down on the floor with cards and just go through all of the steps within this day where this problem occurs that he has, or this need for this thing comes from. So doing that as an exercise on its own beforehand can quite often help with removing that, I work in accounts and I'm only interested really in the point where they need to ring me and find out what's going on, because you've sort of done all of that bit before them. So they've got a whole load of other stuff that they have to look at instead. And obviously the whole idea of like obfuscating product processes in that as well, make it more personal. So it's not about like, create an account, log in and stuff. That shouldn't be, the way that the actions run. It should just be about, maybe I have to visit a website, maybe I have to place an order or whatever. So it's sort of keeping it a little bit more high level.
We have just a couple more minutes left. There is a very important question from Timothy Maguire. What if you have a few personas? Generally, they are primary, secondary, and tertiary personas, on all of which might have different needs. What do you do? Is it a bad idea to do a workshop that covers all of them?
Yeah, so I'd asked for a bit of clarification on this, because he was saying originally about co-mingle personas, which I didn't quite understand. But now I see what he means is like whether or not to map multiple people across a single map. I wouldn't, because I think that you'd have to figure out how to sort of manage all of that. Maybe it would be a different color for a different person, but that's going to very easily get a bit messy. So I would suggest doing individual maps for each individual persona. The reason why I say to focus on the primary persona is because the primary persona is the one that you were trying to sort out to start with. They're the one that has the core problem, and it's that core problem that you serve. And inevitably with any organization, and this is kind of why I said I wouldn't really sort of go into great details about personas, because I've got some very strong opinions on it, is that you actually only need one persona. It's, you solve 80% of problems with 20% of effort or whatever. And I think that if you just focus on that primary persona, the other problems that your other personas have are really niche, but you still need to have nailed down whatever that original problem was and being able to find it. But that's not to say that you shouldn't run the exercise with other personas as well. And I would definitely recommend doing that, absolutely, because it is all about understanding why are they a persona in the first place. That's what it comes down to. So if you're creating personas where there's a slight difference, so like the difference between someone that has bank account A and bank account B, and the only difference between them is that one has 2% interest rate and one has 3%. It's the same problem. Like all you're doing is trying to find a way of fitting your slightly junky business logic into a problem for someone. It's not a problem. But there are instances of where you perhaps provide very different things for very different people, and you want to understand all of the problems that person has, because they're a completely different type of person.
All right. Unfortunately, we weren't able to answer all questions, and there are a few a lot of great questions about certain industries like healthcare, agile processes, and something else. But maybe some other time, feel free to ask questions on Twitter, maybe email
Absolutely.
Andy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Thank
definitely
you.
by all means.
Yeah, thank you,
I just
Andy.
thought, just before
Yeah.
we go, just because Alberto's asked, so the book that I just mentioned was User Story Mapping, which is by Jeff Patton. It's on O'Reilly if you're interested. But as I say, I would strongly recommend that you actually just take a look at his blog and find the very sticky post about user story mapping.
Could you type his name in the chat for us, please?
Sure.
All right.
Let's see.
Afterwards, that will be still visible.
Yep.
Yes. So I'm going to say bye to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was spectacular and super useful. And thank you, Andy, for sharing your expertise with us.
No problem. Slides are on SlideShare. I'll put a link into the share box down there when we're finished.
And the recording will be available at the same link. And we also put it up on UI Breakfast blog a bit later on. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.